Everyone saw a woman who didn't belong at the table. But Alessandro Vitali saw the person who made the entire room possible.
For years, she had learned how to disappear in rooms full of powerful people. But tonight, someone finally saw her.
If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel and stay with us, because the next part is going to be unforgettable.
You're mistaken. That seat at the table is not part of the program. The voice belonged to a man whose cufflinks probably cost more than the chair beneath him. Tessa Bellamy didn't look up from her tablet. She was busy solving a problem the rest of the room didn't know existed. The insult landed anyway. She heard it. So did the man standing 3 feet behind her. Alessandro Vitali had been watching her for nearly an hour by then. He had attended this charity gala for reasons that were officially described as patronage, unofficially. His attendance had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with the fact that Tessa Bellamy had been invited to plan the evening and someone had decided that her job ended at the service door. Alessandro moved his glass aside. He didn't raise his voice. He asked a single, quiet question to the man beside him. The man turned pale within 30 seconds. The seating arrangement for table 12 was being rewritten by staff who clearly wished they were absolutely anywhere else. Tessa still hadn't looked up. She was solving a dietary allergy problem for a guest she had never met, who happened to be the daughter of a senator and the niece of a man whose company Alessandro was about to quietly acquire for reasons nobody in this ballroom understood yet. That moment, the one nobody at the gala noticed, was the moment everything began. The reason it began had nothing to do with the gala itself. It began 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning, when Tessa Bellamy received an email she almost deleted. The sender was the Moretti Foundation, an organization she had worked with twice before. Small events, well-funded, politically delicate. Tessa had earned a reputation for discretion that bordered on instinct. The foundation liked her because she never leaked guest lists, never complained to magazines, never described her clients in terms that would embarrass them at breakfast. That made her valuable. It also made her dangerous, which she didn't know yet. The gala was scheduled for the St. Aurelia Hotel, a property that happened to be owned by a consortium of investors, one of whom was a man named Julian Mercer. Tessa had worked with Julian professionally. He was charming, he was efficient, he was also, in Tessa's quiet professional opinion, slightly too interested in the guest lists of events he had no business attending. She had never mentioned that thought to anyone. Alessandro would mention it later, in a tone that suggested he had noticed exactly the same thing, and had been waiting for someone with Tessa's particular brand of observation to confirm it. The email requested Tessa's presence at a private planning meeting 3 days before the gala. The Moretti Foundation usually worked through junior coordinators. This time, the woman who ran the foundation, Patrice Harrow, wanted Tessa personally. Patrice Harrow was not the kind of woman who requested things twice. Tessa knew enough to accept. The planning meeting took place in a private dining room at the street Aurelia. Tessa arrived exactly on time. She wore a charcoal dress. She had her tablet, she had her coffee, she had the quiet, focused expression of someone who intended to be useful. There were 6 people at the table when she entered. She recognized 3. One was Julian Mercer. One was an attorney whose name she had seen on documents she was specifically not supposed to have seen. The third was Camille Laurent. Camille smiled immediately. The smile did not reach anything important. TV production companies had spent the last decade trying to bottle that smile. They had failed. Tessa had seen it before, at weddings, at galas, at charity luncheons where the guest seating was apparently the most important architectural decision of the century. Camille believed in a version of the world where everyone understood exactly which rooms they were allowed to enter. And the most important job of any hostess was to enforce that understanding gently enough that nobody felt insulted, while also feeling completely excluded. Tessa did not smile back until she had counted the chairs, old habit. When the chair count matched her count of the people present, she relaxed, she sat, she opened her tablet, she waited. Patrice Harrow explained the evening. 12 round tables of 10, auction, 3-course dinner. Honorary chair, a senator. Honored guest. A man whose family had once controlled half the shipping lanes on the eastern seaboard and now controlled other things that polite society preferred not to discuss in mixed company. Tessa's job was to make sure nobody noticed any of that. Her job was flowers, linens, service, music, timing. She smiled. I've done this before. Patrice looked relieved. Camille looked patient. Julian looked at Tessa for slightly longer than professional courtesy required. That was the second warning Tessa didn't notice. The third warning arrived 40 minutes into the meeting. Delivered as casually as a dessert menu. The honored guest, Patrice said, has requested a personal introduction to the lead planner before the evening begins. He likes to thank the people responsible for making his events feel easy. He's also, she added, generously agreed to underwrite the foundation's next 2 galas in exchange for that introduction. Tessa's expression remained pleasant. She knew what was happening. Powerful men often wanted to meet the woman who had made their evening appear effortless. Most of them simply thanked her. A small percentage did not. A smaller percentage did something worse than flirting, which was offering generosity in exchange for proximity, then being offended when proximity was politely refused. Tessa had learned to navigate this terrain the way one navigates a sidewalk at rush hour, with a clear sense of where she intended to go. An even clearer sense of which intersections to avoid, of course, she said. I'd be glad to meet him. Patrice relaxed. Camille smiled. Julian relaxed. The attorney made a note nobody else was supposed to read. Tessa excused herself to take a call that did not exist. She stepped into the corridor and dialed the only person whose instinct for danger matched her own. Marco answered on the second ring. I need a name, she said. The honored guest. He said without hesitation, is Vincent DeLuca. Tessa closed her eyes. Vincent DeLuca was not just any powerful man. Vincent DeLuca was the man who, 10 years ago, had attempted to absorb the Vitelli family's shipping interests through a combination of business pressure and the kind of persuasion that happened in rooms without windows. Alessandro Vitali had survived that campaign. The DeLuca family had not disappeared. They had merely moved to other rooms. Other industries, other layers of polite society, where their money spent quietly and their reputations remained immaculate. Tessa returned to the meeting room. She sat. She smiled. She did not mention Vincent DeLuca. She did not mention that Alessandro had once spent 7 months dismantling a DeLuca-backed venture on 3 continents. She did not mention that the last time the 2 families had shared a venue, 2 of Vincent's closest associates had ended the evening in the hospital with explanations that involved stairs and bad luck and absolutely nothing else. She did not mention any of this because she didn't have to. The street. Aurelia would not have allowed this booking if they didn't already know. Which meant somebody at the ST. Aurelia wanted the 2 families in the same room. Tessa made a mental note. She had, at last count, 11 mental notes about this event. 2 of them were already concerning. She finished the meeting. She thanked Patrice. She shook Camille's hand. She did not react to the slight pressure Camille applied. The kind of pressure that was barely a squeeze and, roughly, equivalent to a velvet glove suggestion about her place in the hierarchy. Tessa had stopped reacting to that pressure in her early 20s. Camille, unfortunately, had never stopped applying it. By the morning of the gala, Tessa had been working for 19 days. She had replaced the florist twice. She had removed 2 guests from the seating chart after receiving what she later confirmed were forged medical excuses. She had identified and quietly dismissed a catering manager whose only relevant qualification was a personal relationship with someone on the foundation board. She had personally walked the kitchen 3 times. She had rewritten the lighting plan because the original designer had apparently believed that illumination was a philosophical concept. She had handled all of this without complaint, without drama, without ever raising her voice. She had also eaten 7 granola bars. She had also hydrated herself exclusively with coffee. She had also avoided her apartment for 4 nights because she was sleeping on the office couch. Her employees knew this. They worked beside her. They called her Tessa. Not Miss Bellamy, not ma'am. Because she had spent 4 years earning that informality by being too tired to enforce formality. They also knew that if anyone mentioned any of it out loud, she would simply disappear into a problem until they felt worse about bringing it up. So they didn't bring it up by 5 in the afternoon on the day of the gala? The ballroom looked immaculate. 340 guests would arrive in 90 minutes. The senator had confirmed, Vincent DeLuca had confirmed. The auction items had been catalogued. The auctioneer's microphone was working. The auctioneer's backup microphone was working. The auctioneer's backup to the backup microphone had been replaced because Tessa did not trust anyone over 50 to understand the importance of redundancy. She stood in the center of the ballroom, hands on her hips, rotating slowly. Something was wrong. She could feel it. The room looked correct. The room smelled correct. The room sounded correct. The room felt incorrect. Tessa Bellamy had learned to trust her discomfort around rooms the way other people trusted weather forecasts. She walked to the service corridor. She checked the staff schedule. She confirmed the kitchen readiness. She confirmed the security posture. She confirmed the auction lot protocol. Everything was correct. She walked back to the ballroom and stood exactly where she had stood before. The feeling had not gone away. It was not in her work. It was in the room. She looked at the seats. She counted them. Table 12, special instructions. Reserved for visiting members of a foundation family. Tessa walked to table 12. She read the seating card. She read it again. The seat marked for Tessa Bellamy. The seat designated for the lead planner to occupy during dinner as a courtesy of the foundation, was placed halfway between the kitchen door and the coat rack. It faced the corner of a tablecloth that had not been ironed correctly. It was not at the table. It was at a small folding chair wedged between a service cart and a stack of unused linens. It was, in the precise language of a particular kind of hostess, not a place at all. Tessa stared at it. Then she walked calmly to Patrice Harrow's assistant. She asked, with no edge in her voice, whether the original seating arrangement had been changed. The assistant confirmed that it had not been changed. Tessa asked whether the foundation's standard courtesy included reserving the lead planner a seat at the main dinner. The assistant confirmed that it had always included this courtesy at every previous gala. Tessa asked who had moved the chair. The assistant's face became an entire weather system. She said she didn't know. Tessa did not push. Tessa very rarely pushed. She simply wrote a note on her tablet. Then she walked to the kitchen and confirmed the dessert plating. Then she walked back to the service corridor and confirmed the staff briefing. Then she looked once more at the folding chair. She did not move it. She did not remove it. She did not request that it be replaced. She simply noted its position. The way one notes the position of a server that has been quietly demoted in a place where servers are never supposed to know they have been demoted. She returned to the center of the ballroom. She pressed a hand against her lower back. Nobody saw this. A photographer 2 rooms away captured a similar gesture in another life and turned it into a stock image that would later appear in an article about competent women in professional settings and would be captioned something thoughtful about quiet endurance. Tessa didn't know that. She was busy being quietly enduring. Across the ballroom, Alessandro Vitali had arrived. He always arrived at places like this with the same precision. He arrived exactly on time. He did not need to be guided, because he had, in fact, designed half the security routing for the venue years before the venue knew it would need routing at all. He did not check his coat. He did not wait for the hostess to greet him. He walked into the room the way weather walks into a region. Conversations adjusted. They always did. He moved through the room, and the room moved around him. Tessa watched him advance from across the corridor and felt nothing in particular. She had met him now at 14 events. She had stopped counting because the number had started to feel like something her employees might quietly notice. Alessandro stopped beside her. He did not greet her. He said, "Table 12." Tessa kept her expression neutral. "How did you—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. They had spent months developing a working vocabulary that included silence and unfinished sentences and the occasional shared look across a room that communicated things that, if spoken aloud, would have required lawyers. He walked toward the ballroom. He did not look at the table. He did not need to. Tessa watched him enter. Within 90 seconds, the head table for the evening's honorary seating happened to accept a last-minute rearrangement that moved it 6 inches to the left. Tessa didn't ask why. The head table now overlooked table 12 directly. The head table's central seat now had a sightline through the entire service corridor. Tessa noticed. She made another note. She did not thank Alessandro. Thanking him would have been a kind of dependency. She had spent an entire summer explaining to herself that she would not allow his power to become the architecture of her dignity. She had succeeded at this mostly, except on the 4 or 5 nights a year when his presence happened to align conveniently with a problem she couldn't solve alone. And those nights did not require thanking because acknowledging them would have meant acknowledging the structure she had built to avoid them. There were 43 minutes until the guests arrived. Tessa had not yet eaten dinner. The folding chair at table 12 had not been moved. Patricia's assistant had gone briefly missing. Camille Laurent had arrived 20 minutes earlier than her arrival time, which was itself a small deliberate act of ownership. Tessa looked at Camille across the service corridor. Camille looked back. She wore the same expression she had been wearing for the past 4 years. It was not unkind. It was simply aware. It was the expression of a woman who knew precisely which room she belonged in and intended to keep that knowledge active in all relevant conversations. Tessa did not engage. Tessa had learned that engaging with Camille was like negotiating with weather. You could acknowledge it, you could dress for it. You could not meaningfully change it. The guests arrived. 340 people entered a room that looked immaculate. The senator spoke briefly about the foundation's mission. The auctioneer warmed up his voice with a story about a wine auction in 1987. Vincent DeLuca entered the ballroom flanked by 2 men whose suits appeared to be tailored by people who had never heard of the word no. Alessandro did not look at Vincent. Vincent did not look at Alessandro. They had not seen each other in 7 years. Their mutual awareness was so total that it occupied the same physical space as the rest of the room. The gala began. Tessa moved through the room the way she always moved through rooms. Quietly, invisibly, with attention to everything and authority over almost nothing that anyone in the room would notice. She checked the senator's microphone. She confirmed the auction timing. She replaced a centerpiece that had begun to wilt from the central air. She redirected a server who had gotten lost between the dessert station and the coat check. She noticed a guest entering with a coat that suggested a temperature-controlled car and a mood that did not. She intercepted him in the corridor. She arranged his coat. She handed him a glass of water and asked whether he preferred the senator's introduction to begin before or after the amuse-bouche. He smiled for the first time that evening. Before she smiled back, she returned to work. This was the strange mercy and cruelty of competence in rooms like this. Tessa made the room feel easy. The room did not understand that feeling easy was not the same as feeling free. Halfway through the second course, the seating card situation came to a small, uncomfortable head. Patricia's assistant appeared beside Tessa. Patrons at table 12 have asked whether their designated event coordinator could join them briefly to acknowledge the foundation's hospitality. Tessa understood immediately. She had been invited to a courtesy visit. She had not been assigned a seat. The folding chair was not the offer. The folding chair was the instruction. Tessa kept her expression neutral. Of course, she said. Give me 5 minutes. She had no intention of joining table 12. She had no intention of sitting in the folding chair. She had no intention of standing at the edge of the table like a vendor awaiting appraisal. What she intended, precisely, was to walk to table 12, thank the patrons, recognize the foundation's hospitality, and then leave. She did this. She walked to table 12. She introduced herself. She smiled appropriately. She thanked the family. She complimented the foundation's continued work. She did not sit. Camille had not yet noticed her. She turned to leave. She had taken 1 step toward the service corridor when she felt it. The moment when the room's opinion of a person shifts from comfortably invisible to conspicuously present. Someone at table 12 had taken her leaving as an insult. The voice belonged to a man whose last name matched the foundation's primary donor. He had clearly been waiting for an opportunity to be offended, he said, with the kind of casual loudness designed to recruit nearby tables into agreement. That perhaps the event coordinator had misunderstood the nature of the invitation. The invitation had been to sit, not to visit. He added that professional staff rarely understood the difference between being welcomed and being tolerated. 3 nearby tables went quiet. 2 more pretended to be having private conversations. Camille, 12 feet away, did not need to turn her head. She had, by long practice, developed a peripheral awareness calibrated precisely to detect the precise social frequency of someone being quietly demoted. Tessa stopped. She had encountered this before. Not always at this volume, not always with this many witnesses. But the structure was familiar. Someone powerful had decided to make a statement using a person who couldn't object without looking ungrateful. The insult was not really about Tessa. The insult was about the man's own sense of control. He had spent the last 10 minutes feeling irrelevant in a room full of people more relevant than him. And Tessa had offered an opportunity to feel important without doing anything important. Tessa did not turn around. She did not explain herself. She did not defend her dignity. She simply paused, half-turned, and said, with the exact polite warmth that made later deniability impossible, "Thank you, I appreciate the clarity. I had assumed the courtesy extended to the planner rather than the chair. But you've corrected that misunderstanding with impressive specificity." The man blinked. The nearby tables resumed their fake conversations with slightly more energy. Tessa walked away. Her face did not change. Her shoulders did not rise, her pace did not alter. She walked to the service corridor. She pressed both hands briefly against her face. She returned to work. Across the room, Alessandro had heard the entire exchange. He had not moved. He had not raised an eyebrow. He had not used his phone. He had done nothing because Tessa had asked him, 3 months earlier. In a conversation that neither of them had explicitly framed as a turning point but had functioned as one. To stop treating her battles as his to fight, he had listened. He had listened so carefully that the act of not moving had been, in its own way, a kind of violence to his own instincts. He had spent 36 years believing that the right response to a person being diminished was to step in front of them. Tessa had explained with the patient precision of someone who had clearly explained this to herself many times. That protection sometimes meant standing still. That was the lesson. That was the difficult one. Alessandro, for perhaps the 4th time in his life, did nothing. Then Camille arrived at his side. She did not bring the insult. She brought something worse. She brought context, she said, smiling pleasantly at no one in particular. The De Luca family hasn't attended a Vitali-adjacent event since the incident in 2017. There's something rather graceful about Vincent's willingness to attend tonight. I think we should acknowledge it. Alessandro looked at her. He said nothing, Camille continued. Of course people will talk. People always talk about Vincent, about the seating, about which families are extending which courtesies, about who has been brought into whose orbit, and about, of course, the planner. She paused delicately. They will assume, naturally, that her presence here is a personal arrangement rather than a professional one. Men do that, she added lightly. They like to attach their events to people who make them feel connected to a woman they find interesting. Alessandro's expression did not change, but something else did. The temperature of the room dropped by approximately 2 degrees. In the way that rooms do when a man whom multiple intelligence agencies have occasionally described as quietly uncategorizable decides that a particular conversation has reached its natural end. Camille noticed. Camille had survived decades of noticing. If you enjoy emotional and powerful stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Because Tessa and Alessandro's story is about to take a whole new turn. He said, with no inflection whatsoever, Tessa Bellamy is the most capable event planner in this region. Her presence here is an invitation from the Foundation. If you would like to discuss who should be seated at which table, I am happy to recommend that you and Patrice discuss it after the senators have left. Camille's smile remained perfect. Her eyes, however, experienced something they rarely experienced. which was a brief, involuntary recalculation. She excused herself gracefully. She went to speak to the senator's wife, who entirely understood that this kind of social infrastructure required regular maintenance. Alessandra looked across the ballroom. Tessa was checking the auction lots. She had not heard the conversation. She had not needed to. The auction began. The wine lot sold for more than Tessa had estimated. The painting lot sold for less. The senator's daughter understated her handbag's provenance in a way that amused 3 different journalists independently. Halfway through the auction, Vincent De Luca stood. The room registered it the way seismographs register distant tremors. Vincent smiled. He approached the auctioneer's podium. He thanked the foundation for its years of service. He pledged a year-end donation that was larger than any previous donation by a factor of 3. He also mentioned, almost as an aside, that his family would be honored to host the foundation's next gala at a private venue of their choosing. 340 people heard this. The senator heard it, Patrice heard it, Camille heard it. Alessandro heard it. The offer was not generosity. The offer was acquisition. The foundation had been one of the few major institutions in the region that had remained genuinely independent of the family rivalries that had quietly defined the city's social calendar for a generation. If Vincent De Luca's family hosted next year's gala, the foundation would, in very practical terms, become part of his patronage network. The independence Tessa had spent 4 years quietly protecting would disappear. Tessa saw this from across the room. She saw it the way she saw wilting centerpieces and misdirected servers. Instantly, completely. Without drama, she did not move. She did not speak. She did not walk to the foundation table. She did not whisper to Patrice. She did not even make a note on her tablet. She simply watched the room. She watched Vincent smile. She watched Patrice's expression shift from gratitude to uncertainty. She watched the foundation's senior board members exchange glances that they believed nobody could read and which Tessa had been reading since she was 19 years old. She saw what would happen next. She saw the months of quiet influence that would follow this gift. She saw the gradual, polite annexation of an institution that had survived precisely because no single family had been allowed to fully claim it. She watched this in approximately 15 seconds. Then she did something very uncharacteristic. She walked directly to Alessandro Vitali. She did not excuse herself. She did not wait for a break in his conversation. She stood beside him until the conversation finished on its own. Alessandro turned. He looked at her. He had seen the Vincent De Luca offer. He had begun already to consider what response would be both appropriate and effective. He had 4 contingencies, Tessa said. Don't, Alessandro paused. Vincent made his offer publicly, she said. The foundation will feel obligated to accept it unless someone at the same level makes a competing commitment in the same room. If you do that, this becomes a contest between 2 families. The foundation loses its independence immediately. The donors will choose sides. The staff will be caught in the middle. Your team will be caught in the middle. She paused. My team will be caught in the middle. Alessandro said nothing for a moment. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that the most powerful thing you can do right now is nothing. He looked at her. She has just been publicly humiliated by a person who has never once in her life done something she could not afford. Yes, and your response is, do nothing. Tessa met his gaze. That was the question that mattered most. That was the question she had spent a year teaching him to ask. Not because doing nothing was kind, because doing nothing was, in this room, the only action that preserved the foundation's ability to choose for itself. Alessandro was quiet for a moment. Then he did something Tess had almost never seen him do. He laughed, not loudly, not performatively, quietly. In a way that surprised even him. You realize, he said, that you are asking the most powerful man in this room to be the least visible. Yes, and you realize I find that extremely difficult. Yes, I have noticed that about you. He looked across the ballroom. Vincent's smile had not changed. The foundation's board members were nodding. Patrice was already thanking him. Alessandro took a breath. Then he handed his glass to Marco. He walked toward the foundation table. He did not approach Patrice. He did not approach Vincent. He approached the chair beside Patrice that was empty. He sat down, he said, very quietly to Patrice alone. I would like to make a gift to the foundation tonight. Not as a challenge to anyone's generosity. Not as a public statement. As a private acknowledgement of work that deserved to be supported. Patrice blinked. She had expected competition. She had prepared for competition. She had not prepared for restraint. Alessandro continued. The gift will not be attached to a venue. The gift will not attach to a host family. The gift will go to the foundation's general fund, to be used at its own discretion. Patrice stared at him. Vincent, 3 tables away, had stopped smiling for the first time that evening. He had recognized the move immediately. A private gift without conditions was precisely the move that undermined his own offer. Not by competing with it, but by removing the social pressure to accept it. The foundation could now refuse Vincent's offer graciously. Accepting both gifts without owing either family control? The independence of the foundation had been preserved by a single act of restraint. Alessandro stood. He nodded to Patrice. He walked back to his seat. He sat down. Marco, beside him, said nothing. He had learned after 11 years that the moments when Alessandro did nothing were the moments that mattered. Across the room, Tessa watched the entire thing. She pressed her hand briefly against the small of her back. This time she allowed herself to notice that she was tired. She turned to return to work. A server appeared beside her with a small plate. Tessa looked down. It was dinner. A complete dinner, protein, vegetables. Dessert coffee. The server smiled. From Mr. Vitali, he added, he wasn't sure what you wanted. So I brought everything on the cart. Tessa stared at the plate. She looked across the ballroom. Alessandro was not looking at her. Alessandro was having a deeply engaged conversation with the senator's wife about the educational merits of private foundation funding. Alessandro had not sent that plate. The plate had arrived through channels. The channels had been organized by someone who had learned, through months of practice, that the most effective way to care for Tessa Bellamy was to make the action invisible. She would thank him later. She would not thank him here. Thanking him publicly would have implied dependency. Thanking him privately would have made her feel something she was not yet ready to name. She ate the dinner. It was excellent. She returned to work. The gala continued. The auction finished, the dessert was served. The senator's speech was brief. Vincent De Luca's smile, which had spent the last 40 minutes recalibrating itself, had finally settled into an expression that was indistinguishable from graciousness and was, in fact, the most dangerous expression of the evening. Vincent stood. He approached the foundation table. He complimented Patrice. He retracted his offer with exquisite politeness. He cited a scheduling conflict that had only just arisen in his family's broader commitments this quarter. Patrice accepted his retraction gracefully. She had been trained in accepting retractions with exceptional grace. Vincent walked past Tessa in the corridor afterward. He did not speak to her. He did not need to. He looked at her for a moment longer than courtesy required. He had understood in that quiet instant that the evening's true architect was not the man his family had spent a decade trying to neutralize. The architect had been a planner with gray shoes and a tablet. Vincent's expression, for one brief moment, contained something that might have been recognition. He walked out. His entourage followed. The evening did not end, it simply became, in a way that nobody in the room explicitly noticed, more honest. Tessa finished her shift at 2 a.m. She had eaten 1 granola bar since dinner. She had solved 11 more problems. She had not raised her voice. She had not sent a single email that required legal review. Alessandro had left at midnight, having spoken to the senator's wife for an additional 11 minutes on the basis that the senator's wife's husband had been kind to his mother 6 months earlier, and the debt had not yet been repaid. Marco had walked out, smiling. He had not smiled at work in approximately 3 years. Tessa sat alone in the ballroom at 2 a.m. The chairs were stacked. The centerpieces had been removed. The auction lot cards had been collected for next year's archive. She looked at the folding chair that had been placed beside the service card at table 12. It was still there, she had not moved it. She would not move it. Moving it would have implied that the insult had mattered enough to be corrected. A server approached, ma'am. Tessa looked up. The server hesitated, then said, with the precise care of someone who had been instructed never to deliver messages from people who did not send messages. Mr. Vitali asked whether you would like a ride home. Tessa considered this. She had been offered many rides by many powerful men. Most of them had carried conditions. This one had carried only the word home, which Marco had chosen specifically because home did not have a possessive pronoun attached to it. Thank you, she said. I'll walk, the server nodded. She had been instructed that this was a likely answer, and that it was not to be questioned. Tessa stood. She pressed her back against the chair. She breathed, then her phone vibrated. She looked at the message. It was from Marco. It said, "The chair has been removed from the building." Tessa stared at the message. Then another message arrived from Marco. It said, "We replaced it with a small table. 2 chairs and a working light, the staff table. As you've referred to it in 19 different contracts, there's a sign. The sign says staff. The sign does not say invisible." Tessa sat back down. She covered her face with her hands. She did not cry. She had not cried at work in 8 years. She was not going to start now. But she sat there for a very long time, then she wrote a reply. It said, "Thank you for the chair." Marco did not respond. Marco had not been trained to respond to thank yous from Tessa Bellamy. He had been trained to understand that her thank yous were not acknowledgments of favors. They were acknowledgments of lessons. The gala had ended. The foundation had survived. Vincent had not acquired it. Alessandro had not needed to claim it. The staff table, for the first time in the building's history, had been recognized as a table 3 weeks later. The foundation board invited Tessa to submit a proposal for their permanent event planning contract. The proposal was substantial. It included staffing protocols, table assignments, security considerations, and a long, detailed section on the architecture of dignity in formal events. The section used no metaphor. It used no policy language. It described in clear, professional terms how the foundation's planners, servers, and coordinators would be treated at every event. Regardless of donor pressure, Patrice accepted the proposal on the spot. Patrice had been looking for that section for 9 years. She had simply never thought to phrase it as politely as Tessa had. Tessa signed the contract. She had by then learned something about herself that she had not fully admitted. She had spent much of her early career believing that doing her job well meant working invisibly. She had understood that belief for a long time. She had begun to suspect it might be incomplete. The chair had been removed. A table had been placed. A sign had been added. The sign had not been added because Tessa had demanded it. She had not demanded anything. The sign had been added because Alessandro had understood, finally, that the work she did was not invisible. The work she did was the room. A room that does not see its planners is a room that does not work. A room that does not see its staff is a room that does not deserve its guests. Tessa understood this. Alessandra understood this. The staff understood this. Camille understood something different. Camille understood that her usual tools had stopped working in rooms where patience, restraint, and the quiet removal of folding chairs were the new methods of power. Camille did not like these methods. Camille had spent 30 years studying the geometry of inclusion. She had no intention of being outmaneuvered by a man whose primary move was to do less. She would, eventually, attempt another approach. That approach would not succeed. But the moment it failed would be the moment Tessa Bellamy understood exactly what kind of future she had earned. And what kind of man had sat beside her in silence while she earned it. That moment had not yet arrived. It would arrive on a Tuesday afternoon 6 weeks from now, when Tessa would receive a private invitation to the Vitali estate for the first time. The invitation would not be framed as personal. It would be framed as a thank you for the foundation's work. It would include a tour of the property. It would include lunch. It would include Marco. It would not include anything that could be misread as a romantic gesture. Because Tessa had spent months teaching Alessandro that the most respectful thing he could do was to invite her without implication. He had done exactly that, she would accept, and during that lunch, on the grounds of a house whose architecture had been designed to make its owner look smaller than he was, Tessa Bellamy would look at Alessandro Vitali across a small table set for two. And she would say, with the exact tone she used when correcting table assignments, that she had not realized until this moment that the most powerful man in any room she had ever worked had spent the last year learning how to be quiet. He would look at her, and he would say something he had not said to anyone in 20 years. That he had not been learning how to be quiet. He had been learning how to listen, and Tessa would smile. The way she smiled at weddings when a problem she had prevented was about to be solved by exactly the person who had prevented it. The smile would not be photographed, the smile would not be described. The smile would not appear in any article or auction catalog or seating chart in any room, in any city in which she would work for the next 30 years. It would simply be a smile, made by a woman who had spent her career making rooms work, sitting in a room where she could finally rest. Real status has never been determined by which table someone is allowed to sit at. It is revealed in how they treat the people who were never invited to the table in the first place, and a folding chair, removed quietly at 2 a.m. by a man who had finally understood that the most important protection a person could offer was the decision not to take credit for their work, had proven something that no expensive wine auction and no public seating chart had ever managed to prove. That the woman people kept trying to dismiss had never been invisible at all. She had been the room.